Good day, everybody. Thank you, Melanie, for the introduction. Just to touch on that, I but more than I can chew with my presentation. So what I will do is I will skip some slides, but I will cover what is the most important to share with the audience. The title of my research is Rock Art Presentation, a comparative analysis between the Maluti Drakensberg Park in South Africa and the Vézère Valley in France. So what is important in this study is that there is a growing interest on heritage presentation and interpretation, and is becoming a popular phenomenon in social science research. So as part of that, Dr. Duval has mentioned how there's a need for an increased need for heritage presentation research. So from that perspective, my study is grounded in the interpretation and presentation of heritage. I would like to just define the two terms based on what WPIC has defined to be. They are developing new concepts that are going to be the internationally accepted concepts for heritage presentation, which I will delve into a bit later. But what is important to note is that the interpretation of heritage is a meaning-making process where the aim is to have participation and experience. And secondly, heritage presentation is a range of methods that deliver experience, raising awareness and understanding of interpreting the significance of heritage. My focus is on specific sites in the northern Drakensberg. I'm focusing on the Moabane, Sigubudu, and the Mkosheni rock art shelters. And in the central part, Battle Cave, the Kamberg, and Gaimpo shelter. In the southern part, I'm focusing on the pornographic rock art shelter. But at the same time, I also want to mention that to a lesser, greater extent, I'm also focusing on such discoveries such as the Heimwil and Fort Museum in the southern Drakensberg and the KwaZulu-Natal Museum. In the Vézère Valley, my focus is on Lascaux 2 and Lascaux 4, which are two of the replicas of the original cave, Roofnek, Pondagom, Combarel, and Kablank. So in the map on your left, it's the area in the Vézère Valley, and on your right is the area of the Drakensberg Park. So what is highlighted here is the World Heritage Site, which stretches from the Garden Castle in the southern Drakensberg to the Royal Natal in the northern Drakensberg. So one of the key things that grounded my study was the discovery that there's not much attraction for the rock art in Southern Africa compared to France. So I look for the most part into the principles of the e-commerce international charter and also other supporting theories. But what I also would like to mention is that there is, like I mentioned, 5 new principles that are going to be the international principles for heritage interpretation and presentation, but it's in a draft stage at the moment that the International Center is working on. It's a center based in the south of France, one of UNESCO's Category 2 institutions. For my literature part, I'm just going to give a brief background and touch on some of the most important parts in history due to time. So the first section speaks about the Vézère Valley. What is a striking discovery is that when rock art was sort of accepted as a scientific phenomenon in society, as early as the early 1900s in France, there was a sort of golden rock art presentation period where people wanted to see Lascaux in 1940. I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of people. And in the case of South Africa, knowing that we had colonization and all that, that was not exactly the case. But what happened was, when we transitioned into a democratic state, there was an increase for the demand of presentation, as Dr. Ndlovu has mentioned in some of his work post the apartheid era. So that was our period in South Africa where we could move away from rock art being a marginalized source in heritage presentation and sort of present it in a way that has never been done before. So to do this study, I'm doing a case study between the two regions as my research design, and I'm also doing a qualitative study where I spent 4 months in France and 2 months in the Drakensberg. I selected 8 participants from both regions where I interviewed tour guides that are interpreting the rock art on a daily basis in both regions. I ensured that all of the ethical considerations are upheld according to the Faculty of Humanities. So in this picture on your left, it's a photograph of the outside of the fond in the Vézère Valley, and on the other side, it's an interpretation center in the northern Drakensberg that I will explain a bit in my analysis. So this is the Siapambilitos interpretation center that was community built in the next picture. I was lucky, and when I say lucky, it's an understatement. I was very lucky to go to France to see the outside of the original cave. I will give more context to that. So this is the cave that is arguably by many considered to be the greatest rock art cave in the world. So when I went to the rock art cave, what I did was I was very tempted to take a step down there because I wanted to go to the door. But then something told me not to do it, and I asked the conservator. He told me that there's actually an alarm that would go off just if I had to step there. So it just shows you the value of the rock art in France. In this picture, I'm showing you on the top left, it is the entrance of Lascaux 4, the replica cave. And in the middle, it's one of the photographs that were presented in Lascaux 2. And on the right, it's Lascaux 4 again, where I am standing in the replica cave. On the left bottom, it's the outside of Rouffigny Cave. And in the middle, it's part of the members that were part of the conference last year in France. In the next illustration, on the top left, it's one of the beautiful pictures I took in the southern Drakensberg on my way to the pornographic rock art shelter. And in the middle was the outside of the shelter. And on the right is me walking on a very strenuous path to Mkosheni rock art shelter in the northern Drakensberg. Here under is pictures from Battle Cave. I'm just showing it for a bit of visual context. So the picture in the middle is one of the panels that Battle Cave was named after, where 10 people were in battle. So now I will touch on my 4 main themes in my discussion, analysis, and findings. So for time's sake, I'm not going to go too much into it. There's particular points because this is what you can read when you get the presentation. But in this case, you can see some of the negative remarks that were made regarding the lack of interpretative structures and accessibility in the regions. So, for example, in the northern Drakensberg, there's no interpretation center. So the picture I showed about Siapambilitos serves as the interpretation center. However, it was found to be not in a conducive state and not functional. And then I also touch on some of the remarks that were made that was observed at the conference at the National Museum in the Vézère Valley, where one of our delegates today has done some research with a team on how the Lascaux Cave was perceived based on the visit we had there. And it was found that some people are not exactly happy with visiting replica caves. So in the context of accessibility, on the left is a picture of the garden castle area in the southern Drakensberg. And what was striking for me was how they don't mention rock art at all. There's no sign of rock art at all. And when I entered and eventually went to the SMVelo office, the officer there didn't know the name of the rock art site. And there's no signs that was pointing to the rock art site. What was also a unique instance was it was a bit challenging to get a guide on that specific day. But then what happened was I got permission to go on a self-guided tour. But what I discovered was that anyone can actually go, based on the sites I visited in the Drakensberg. Anyone can, there's uncontrolled access. You know, you can go there if you know the direction to the site. And on the other picture, it's just a picture I took outside of the Fondagom that just shows you how much information sources and directional signages there are in the Vézère Valley. So what is also important to note is that when you go to the Vézère Valley, you go to the railway station, you see rock art everywhere. You go to Intermarché, you see rock art on the walls. You know, you go into the street of Les Azes, they're selling merchandise of rock art. You must think to yourself, is rock art really this important? I mean, you understand? So rock art is really highly invested there. For example, on your left, it's a photograph that was captured at the Cap Blanc rock art site. So to put it into context, the Cap Blanc rock art shelter, it's not a cave like the normal caves in France. It's more like a good example to compare to South African shelters. And what they did here to sort of protect the site, it's actually very interesting for, based on the discussions yesterday that were made regarding, you know, how can we conserve the rock art site? So that's also interesting. And on the other side, it's a photograph of me walking to the Mkoseni rock art site in the Drakensberg, northern Drakensberg. So it makes us think about, you know, as an international tourist, between the two pictures, the difference in accessing the rock art sites. And then this is another shocking discovery that the Camberg Rock Art Center, Interpretation Center was unfortunately closed. And on the left, it's just a photograph of how they don't even name the rock art sites. You know, this is a World Heritage rock art site, but the name is nowhere to be seen when you go to the site. So that's also quite interesting. And also, again, if you compare to Cap Blanc, for example, there's like a phrase there that of the 14, a list of 14 interpretations of what you find at the site. So it sort of lists every single engraving, monumental sculpture there is. And what they do is, it's literally a laminated sheet. You know, as a tourist, you go there, you get this sheet, you already have an idea of what you can see in the site. That's sort of like initial interpretation that I think we lack a lot in South Africa and in the Drakensberg. So there's quite a lot of signage in the Vézère Valley, and that sets the scene for rock art interpretation. Like I mentioned, you go stop at the railway station, you see a big panel of drawings of rock art, and you just sort of get mentally ready to view the sites. So if you look at the Drakensberg, you will find that, especially in the northern and the southern Drakensberg, there's not been a lot of investment made. And you will be surprised to find also that, you know, 3 of the sites I visited are not on the AMAFA list, on the official accessible sites on their website, although these are sites that are supposed to be seen by the world. And what's also interesting in the case of Drakensberg compared to the Vézère Valley is that the distance makes it a bit complicated in open-ended sites, because, like, for example, going to Mkoseni Rock Art Shelter, I walked there for a total of just over 5 hours. And a striking finding was that the tour guide is not AMAFA accredited. He takes me there for walking more than 5 hours. He interprets rock art for less than 5 minutes. And on top of that, there's another tour guide that went with us because the rock art guide in that instance didn't know where the site was. So the issues that have been discussed in previous literature, it's still very relevant. 3 out of the tour guides in the southern Drakensberg were found to be unaccredited tour guides. And then what's also interesting is, on your left, you will see an example of rock art in the Fondagom. On the top, you can see what is in the cave, and at the bottom, you can see what how they sort of show us the rock art, right? So these are some of Abri Bruhl's work, and it's a very complex issue because, I mean, interpretation should be updated on a regular basis. However, some of the work of the early 1900s are still significant in the Vézère Valley. And that made me sort of think that we're not sort of valuing our rock art enough to make people see the value of it. Like I mentioned in Cap Blanc, you know, you go there, you can see all of the interpretations that are available, and we don't have that in South Africa. This is just on the top left, a picture of the Van der Gom, and on the bottom, it's a one of the sculptures from Kaap Langs, just to give you a bit of visual context to the sites. This was one of my unexpected findings in the southern Drakensberg, where I still don't know the name of this rock art site. The tour guide also didn't know the name, who took me on a guided tour to the site. And what's interesting was when I arrived at the site, I arrived the day before, and then the owner didn't even mention, he actually denied any rock art at the site until I informed him that I was sent from the tour guide, who I named to him. And then the owner let me into the camp, and then I could visit the site. It's close to the Kotso horse trails in the southern Drakensberg. So what's also interesting is that there's not really an interpretation plan for tour guides in the Drakensberg. Like, for example, in the northern Drakensberg, the owner of Chiapambile tours, his own interpretation is persistent in is throughout the tour guides that work under him. They work based on what he knows. And to be fair, he's not like he has some experience, a lot of experience, but not so much the necessary background from a educational perspective. This leads to situations where tour guides interpret the rock art without having the necessary knowledge to make visitors feel like I need to go home and tell other people to come see this rock art. And that's where the value aspect comes into rock art presentation. So in the southern, in the Vézère Valley, it was interesting to find that, there's an interpretation center that was dedicated to rock art presentation in the area that was developed in 2010. So why this is important is because this is what was envisaged with the Origin Center in South Africa when that was developed, but that has changed over the years. But when you go to the center in Les Hazes, you can go with your family there. I mean, there's rock art play games for kids, educational tools for them to learn about rock art from 2-3 years old. And I have seen actually people, like I've seen children go play with these things, so I've been there. It's also interesting that there's a lot of information available, research on the rock art region, a fundamental amount of research. And to be fair to South Africa, we also have a lot of research, but what is happening with the research is a good question we can ask. And then in the southern Drakensberg, what was interesting to find was that, the Heimwil Fort Museum, how community are taking efforts into their own hands to sort of present the heritage of the Drakensberg. So, for example, you find a rock art brochure at the Heimwil Fort Museum, but you don't find a brochure at prominent rock art sites. And there where you also find brochures like at Camberg, and the rock art picture, there's one picture out of 14 in the brochure, and it's the very last picture in the brochure. That's for Camberg and another site in the central Drakensberg. Battle Cave, yes. So just to give you a little bit of visual context, for me, the most important part of rock art presentation is to drive social cohesion and to do that in a sustainable approach. So what is in this picture is sort of a breakdown of the torus numbers in the Vézère Valley based on observations and research that I've done. And it's also interesting to note that it's very complex to do this in a South African context because, for example, you go on a tour guide with one of the guides, they don't really record the numbers. Even the prices based on my experience, the tour guides made their own prices. All of them have different prices, although the custodian system disagrees with that to a large extent. So, for example, let me just put it this way, I paid some 1,000 rands to go view the rock art. But that was based on how it works. Like, for example, in the northern Drakensberg, the initial price was 1,500 per site. That was what the first communication was from the tour guide. And it's also very problematic to engage with tour guides directly. And just to touch on some of the recommendations, so in the Drakensberg case, there's a need for us to move away from the custodian system, to move away, look at a different model that can better improve presentation, knowing that management plays such a key role in presentation of cultural heritage. There's also a need for Amafa and Ezemvelo to restore their relations, because it has been problematic from the very grounding of it. And what was also discovered, contrary to previous literature, was that Amafa started working with Ezemvelo in 2004 and not in 1999 when the temporary agreement was signed. I would also lastly recommend a replica dome for the Drakensberg rock art. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Curtis. Yes. Curtis, you're ready for the question of the expert of the Drakensberg? As we have many in the room.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I've been following your work with interest because it's a subject of interest to me. I mean, I have a lot of things to say, but I won't say all of them. I'll discuss others with you. But just to assist you with the naming, when you say, and I see my Basotho colleagues are here, so they will confirm that. But when you're talking about Maloti Drakensberg, it means that you are talking about the whole water site, which includes also Slabatebe. But when you're talking about only the South African part, you say it's uKhahlamba Drakensberg Park. I know this because I'm privy to the discussions, between DFFE, which in South Africa is in charge of water sites, and Ezemvelo. And it's been a long-held legal debate about the branding issues. So Ezemvelo has succeeded in insisting that it should be called uKhahlamba Drakensberg Park. Unless you are talking about Slabatebe as well, then you say, Maloti Drakensberg. So just that in your writing. And you also listed the rock art sites that are part of your study, and you mentioned Camberg Rock Art Center. Camberg Rock Art Center is obviously not a site, so it's just a minor issue. But let me get to some critical issue. Your conclusion makes reference to 2004, I think, or was it 2002, in terms of the relationship between Amafa and Ezemvelo. That is not actually correct, but I can give you the details outside, the setup, because there is also something that you need to be aware why there's this, lack of harmony, between Amafa and Ezemvelo, and it's something that you've got to contextualize in your study. And there is history that I know of that I can happily assist you, with that. Now let's come to the accreditation issue. I hate the terminology custodians, and it's something that I've always been very vocal about, to Amafa and others. It sounds very insulting to me, because when you look at the other tour guides, you call them tour guides, but when you talk about local communities, they are called custodians. When they are delivering, or they are supposed to deliver exactly the same message. I've always considered that to be very racist, and I've been vocal about that. But here is the issue. Amafa is a heritage authority in the province. To begin with, and this is you needing to be critical so that you understand why some things are happening the way they are. Being a World Heritage Site, it's a national responsibility. So your first question should be, why should Amafa even be playing a part in the management of a World Heritage Site in the province? That's a critical question that we've got to answer, and it's got to do with the politics of the province. Secondly, Amafa as a heritage authority, and I must say to colleagues who are not aware, Amafa is the only province, well, KwaZulu-Natal is the only province in South Africa that has got its own Provincial Heritage Act over and above the National Act. what qualifies them to be a training authority, to go around and train custodians? What is the legality of the certificates that are being given? These are questions that you've got to be critically engaging with. Equally so, you then ask yourself a question to say, who does the training within AMAFA? And how qualified are they themselves? That's another critical question, to answer. I was in that position in 2001 when I was still an employee at the time. So I know intimately, those particular politics. And lastly, AMAFA has got this concept, which, looking at open sites, sites that are open to the public, you've got to engage with. They've got this concept of, in the Drakensberg, closed and open sites, which I've never understood. Look at the Dima Rocket Center, which you say the famous Didima. The famous Didima is famous probably because it's named after Didima Gorge. But AMAFA say no one is allowed to go to Didima Gorge. And that's one of the most beautiful rock art sites for those. I'm looking at the people who are from the province and are familiar with the rock art there. Those are where some of the most beautiful sites are found. Yet the public are not allowed, supposedly, to be taken there by a guard. If you go there, you go there illegally. I mean, I was based at Didima. I know people are always going to Didima because people will pay, those who are really keen on rock art, they will pay whatever it costs, to find a guide to take them there. So these are some of the issues to say, what is open, what is closed? I mean, the whole bag is open to anybody who is hiking, but yet a very keen person going to Didima Gorge can only be taken to Brotherton Rock Art side, where you almost have got nothing painted there. Or they go to Procession Shelter, where equally all you see are beautiful human figures in procession and not much, or even to, the waterfall shelter on the private land owned by the hotel nearby. So these are the issues that you've got to critically, engage with to say, why is it that the least attractive sites are open to the public, with an exception of Game Pass. Game Pass is open to the public and it's one of the best sites in the Drakensberg. So yeah, I just think, you've got to apply a bit more critical thinking, in your evaluation of what is happening on the ground. And we can discuss the other things.
Thank you. And there is a question here.
Hi, Curtis. Thank you for the presentation. You comparing the two areas, the Drakensberg, the rock art in the Drakensberg here in South Africa, and also overseas, Glasgow and other sites. What would be your suggestion? Our experience when we went to Glasgow last year, we were taken by, I would say, so to use the frame, tour guides who have at least a master's degree. And they gave us a tour around the sites, and they would ask, and they would differentiate between intellectual property, and what we can see. So now coming this side to South Africa, it's a different case. And I've raised this issue with the CEO of AMAFA, that how about we also hire students who have just completed their master's degrees to be the ones who lead or give this intellectual property to our local tour guides, to train them, or to also do an internship, given that as a part-time, partly as a formal training for our master's students who are looking for employment or who are venturing into the heritage side. What is your take on that? Do you think it will be a plausible idea or not so much a plausible idea, given the issues that we have with local tour guides and intellectuals? And I don't like to say that terminology, but yeah,
Just before you answer, Curtis, just to let you know that this afternoon, Raphael will give a presentation. He's a guide. So he's the guide at Game Pass. So we will also have his point of view. Curtis, you can answer?
I do think it's a good idea if, the guides can get more training, because to be fair on them, there's not a structure really to even take them into the direction of getting more knowledgeable about the sites, because it is the case that a lot of the guys don't really have the necessary background to present the rock art, right? But like I said, to be fair on them also, there's not really a structure to change the situation. So that's why that is a very good idea that you have mentioned. I think it's something that can work, yes.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to bring in that I think you need to consider the history of a site like, well, the site of Game Pass and Canberra Broadcast Centre. Because when I went there in 2003, and if you had been doing this study then, you would have been raving about it. It was absolutely phenomenal, a great tourist experience. So I'm sure Raphael will touch on this, and I do a bit later, just to consider that. The history of these centers and why they are no longer like this.
Yeah, there are still two questions, and after it's finished, so question here, and after it's finished for the question for Curtis.
Hello, Curtis. Thank you very much for briefly taking us to France and also the Drakensberg. In your presentation, I get this sense or idea that the presentation methods in France, you tend to seem to be like they are more superior and more glorified than the methods that we are using here in South Africa. So I would like also to just check on your view, or take your view or your thought. To what extent can interpretive methodologies developed in South Africa be reliably applied to study or presentation of art in France? And how do historical biases and different physical contexts complicate such cross-cultural comparisons?
So Kelvin agree with the question.
Okay, so I think firstly, like Dr. Ndlovu has mentioned, it has to be like, I actually also want to add it to my recommendations. I didn't add it in the presentation, but I have a recommendation for, for us to have a golden period again for rock art presentation in particular, because for example, the problem we have is at the moment with the guides, the policy to become an accredited guide, you don't need to have background in history, archaeology, or heritage. You can become a rock art guide without any of that knowledge. So that's another problem we have. That's why it's a bit bigger than, like, for example, Amafa is criticized a lot, but at the same time, like Dr. Ndlovu has mentioned, there's not a institution to actually present the rock art of the Drakensberg. Amafa is partially, because they are sort of like a managing body, they have some responsibility. That's why a lot is also referenced towards them. So that's another issue to put into consideration. The second point is that I think we lack, it was also mentioned yesterday, we lack educational awareness about the rock art. In France, on the radio, people talk about rock art every day. I don't recall hearing people speak about rock art in South Africa since I can remember. So there's a lot of things we need to look into, and that also, for example, like it was mentioned with the tour guides, like at Roofniak, for example, the owner told me that he selects guides who, for example, has finished their masters and who have the necessary knowledge about the field to present the rock art to the public. And in South Africa, it's, like I've mentioned, the sites I visited, it's accessible, it's uncontrollable access, so you can almost just go there. Anyone can go there. And I put it in the context of, I'm in Glasgow. If someone were to be found in Roofniak unauthorized, in France, it's such a big thing. That person will be prosecuted immediately, I think.